Hey everyone, welcome back to another DevOps Bootcamp session. Super excited for this one. And today we're talking about people over process. So as we looked into the previous sessions, there's no one standard definition when it comes to DevOps. It's DevOps is like a union, of all the people and the processes and the tools and stuff. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get started, I'm going to give a huge shout out to our panelists here, Steve and Tiffany, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. How about we go with Tiffany first?
Sure. Hi, Kunal. Thanks for hosting this session. And hey, everyone. My name is Tiffany Japcha. I'm currently a data engineering manager at Vox Media. But before that, I've been a part of the CI/CD space, software delivery. I was a consultant at Red Hat as well. So I've been doing quite a bit of work around OpenShift, different open source communities as it relates to different DevOps tools in the cloud ecosystem. So super glad to be a part of this panel, and I hope I can share some of my insights being in the space for quite some time.
Steve, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm Steve Miller. I'm a senior software engineer for Plex Systems. I come up from a more traditionally operations background. So probably about 15 years or so as a system administrator, and then slowly moved into more of a DevOps role. So building out more development methodologies and working with the development teams. And again, yeah, thank you, Kunal, and really looking forward to being part of this panel.
Most definitely. Thank you, Tiffany and Steve, for introducing yourself. So let's get started with the agenda that we have over here. And before we get started, for everyone who has joined us live, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure I ask the questions to the panelists. So you can ask about literally anything. It's an open-ended discussion. Yeah, feel free. All right. So Steve, can you maybe tell us a little bit about, like you mentioned, your experiences? I'd love to hear Tiffany's thoughts on this as well. What does like your ideal work environment look like given your experience? So what has your experience been like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because you think, oh, what would be the perfect environment? The two environments I've been exposed to in my experience in DevOps, I've served on a centralized DevOps team. So within a company, like you have a group of individuals that are all labeled DevOps engineers, and they act as kind of a central resource for various development teams. That model's okay. It's somewhat successful, but it in some ways enforces like that silo, right? You have the DevOps people, and then you have generally dev teams and sometimes separate operational teams. So I tend to shy away from that model. The one I prefer is being an embedded DevOps engineer, I call it. So as an individual being part of a development group, some sort of agile team, and then you are the ops person as in that team, but you participate in daily stand-ups. You work with individuals to keep their infrastructure going. So I prefer that model just because it keeps you closer to the development life cycle. So I think it allows you to provide faster feedback. So that's my personal opinion. My ideal work environment is that embedded DevOps engineer.
Thanks for sharing, Steve. Tiffany, would you like to share your views on the same?
Yeah. I love that we're talking about like different models and hierarchies for DevOps roles and how that looks like in different organizations, because like I think it's always different for different use cases, and there's some situations where having a centralized model for DevOps or like a platforms team can be helpful. But I do agree with Steve that I do really prefer when there are DevOps folks or SRE folks that are embedded into specific product or specific business line concerns, because you can start to get into very specific asks that are tailored to specific applications or microservices architectures, and that can be like very, very specific use cases with very specific domain requirements. Like maybe latency is really important, and maybe whatever it happens to be, maybe security is really important, right? And you need to be thinking about data privacy and these kinds of things. And you can't get as much of that specialization in a centralized model than versus like a more hybrid model where people are integrated and they can, they can address needs in a very kind of short feedback cycle loop.
Yeah, and it's not like DevOps when we talk about it. It's no longer like just a trend. It's like some set of practices and some, patterns for the organization. So for enterprises, it's like it poses a lot of advantages. So we can talk a little bit more about that, like um, the vision around DevOps, right? So what's the story behind it? Why are you doing it? What are some advantages? Tiffany, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. Something that's just been really important to me over the past year or so is just this idea of a vision and a mission around why you're doing what you're doing, right? And I like to call this like your overarching story. The what do you want to be known for? That's what we should be asking ourselves when it comes to people and processes and DevOps. Because at the end of the day, we can have all of these tools. We can do, we can basically set any goal that we want and accomplish it. Like literally, like that's been the history of software engineering, everything that we do in technology. We set goals, we solve them, we solve these interesting, complex challenges. But you can't really have an overarching team and cohesive team without that story of like why you're doing it. And so I really encourage everyone who's thinking about their people, their organization, like DevOps as a whole, to really think about, well, what do you want to be known for and why are you doing this work?
Steve, would you like to add on your points as well?
Yeah, completely agree with Tiffany. I've seen, in my experiences, I've seen a lot of companies that just simply relabel their system administration or their operations team DevOps because that's how I get higher level candidates. But they don't really have a larger vision of really integrating operations and development itself. They keep them siloed off. So completely agree with Tiffany that really is key, is to have a higher level vision, and buy-in even from like upper management is certainly beneficial.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Tiffany and Steve. Yeah, Tiffany, go ahead. You were saying something.
Yeah, and I think also like it can be sometimes difficult because how do you set a vision for something that you haven't had conversations around or something that you don't even understand? And so these are some of the sometimes very big bottlenecks in the process, right? And I think one of the best things that we can really do in the space is have conversations around it.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. So an organization that has not implemented these practices and they want to get started. So like Steve mentioned, like you mentioned, so what is like the pathway for them? And how does one know that they actually need, let's say, these sets of practices? Because obviously there are lots of advantages, but how does one make sure?
Steve, did you want to take this one? I know we can go very deep into like some of the symptoms and sort of challenges that you may start to notice in organizations that can
we can. That's an interesting topic. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. At least for me, I'll jump in. And if you can add to this as well. Like I'm sure you've seen some of this as well. As like I think one of the biggest ones is when there's frustration in the team. So like the biggest indicator is you get to the end of your sprint or you get to the end of a quarter and you ask, so what did we deliver? And the answer was, well, we made some code changes, but none of it went to production. I think that's one of the biggest ones is if you were to look at the entire kind of flow of deliverables that were made in any particular time, that there was no flow.
Yeah, definitely add on there, like especially like the delivery of product, especially from a traditional ops perspective, like before the DevOps trend kind of became. As an operation person, you tend to be very disconnected from the actual release cycle, right? You're keeping, kind of the server operating system and stuff alive. So part of that, like, and why I do like kind of that embedded DevOps engineers, it puts you closer to the dev cycle, so you actually see kind of the results of your efforts. So yeah, I agree that a lot of like kind of the warning side of why DevOps would be useful is when you see a lot of dissatisfaction from the workforce because you're not really seeing the results of your efforts. I think everybody as a human wants to see like the work I put in, it's going to a good end result. So, I'm delivering a product that's solving problems for a customer. So ultimately, that's generally why we're here in IT, right? We're trying to solve problems ultimately. So,
yeah. And some people may have like this, they may get like misunderstand like, so when you talk about people over process, like what does it really mean? And does it really, the misconception people can have is it means, let's say, no process at all? Is that what it means? Not really, right? So maybe we can talk a little bit more about what does it actually mean by people over process? Because we see people talking about people a lot. It's like the company is driven by people, or, they're supporting people, you're listening to people. What does it actually mean by people over process?
Yeah, I like that question. I think it kind of goes back to what we were like the question that we were just answering about. How do you know what are some of the like symptoms that you may have that indicate that DevOps could be useful, and certain practices that we use in DevOps could be really useful. I think it's that like picking up on toil and picking up on frustrations, right? Because if we care about our people, then we can that's sort of the trigger, the starting point to us having bigger and greater discussions around, well, what can we automate? What can we start to bring in? What kinds of processes can we introduce? Because at the end of the day, like our processes, all they are is just like a foundation for the minimum amount of work that we want to be able to support. So our processes support our people to, like, on their worst days or when they're out, right? We have XYZ process to help support like this thing that we want to achieve. That's it. Sometimes when we conflate our processes, say like, oh, this is the best amazing thing, we can now, I don't know, we now don't need people in this process, in this like whole cycle or this whole process, for lack of a better word, then that's when we start to really forget that, well, what happens when we're working with new technologies or new use cases? And we sometimes, even in the process of forgetting about our people, we forget about the practices that we bring in. We forget about the tools. And what happens is you end up having different things happen in your organization. Like the SolarWinds hack was a good example of how we trusted our processes so much that no one kept a good eye on what that was, and so that led to a supply chain hack, right? So I think there's just a lot of misconceptions around like how do you balance your processes with people. It's not one or the other, right? It's like what you're saying, Kunal. It's not like you pick one and then you just don't have any processes, or you pick processes and you just don't have people. It's all like, I like to think of it as it's all interconnected between your technology, your people, and your process.
So from what you're saying, I think I believe what you mean is like people over process. It does not mean like there's no process. It's basically like there's already a process in place, right? Because everyone should be aware of what like the outcomes are, what the goals are, and then everyone on the team can work towards it. Steve, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, completely agree with Tiffany. That really, and like what I'd add too, like in a good organization, process tends to represent best practices, right? I do this, and then as a team, I come together and like, oh, this is kind of the best path generally forward, just to provide a good guidance if members are gone or as people transition to different roles. What I'd like to add, and what I've seen in some organizations, is where you get so hung up on process that like this is the way it was decided 5-10 years ago, and we never will move because this was considered best practice, and it might have been best practice then. So I think the emphasis of people over process, your process should be flexible enough that as new technologies get moved in, as people with different experiences come onto the team, you adjust those processes. So make sure to always focus on the people first. So that'd be the only thing I'd add.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point. I have to jump in because that's such a good point. And you have to look at it from like every part of the software delivery lifecycle too. When I think about like processes where people just say like, oh, this is the best that you can do, and we have to do this way because who so and so did it this way, and like it has to work for our team. And you're like, forcing people into this process that, you know, someone else defined. It wasn't by your team, right? And I always think about Git flow. And I remember being on a project where, you know, we were just starting out, and like literally the team was like 2 or 3 people. And we wanted to have a Git flow process where we, you know, we had this full blown, very heavy process around how we wanted to merge changes. And we were just getting started. We didn't even have a code base to maintain. And that's what I always think about. Like, I'm like, wow, we're just starting, literally just starting. And we can't even agree because, you know, we're trying to microfit processes into all of these aspects.
Oh, you remind me of a project I was involved in with, it was a similar story. They didn't want to go full Git flow, but the person trying to introduce Git into, I think it was a chef recipe, if I recall, but they wanted to do a sophisticated branching strategy. And they're like, well, you know, if we need to do bug fixes, we'll do cherry picks against, and it's like, we're 3 people. We know, whoa, hold on there. So yeah, sorry, you just brought up a lot of memories of someone who wanted to introduce a lot of sophisticated process where none was perhaps not needed at the time.
Yeah. And I believe one of the reasons for this, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons might be that processes change, right? But in order to make a great product, you do need some people who are passionate about it. So in the end, I believe people care more about the product and not like the processes. That because processes change. It's not like it's like a well-defined process where everyone works in a different way. So what would you say about that? Like, is that true, or would you like to add on to it? Like, what might be the reason for this? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say like people care about the vision. Like people care about the outcomes. Like there's always a reason why you want to use a particular technology, or you're up late at night, or you stay an extra like 30 minutes at work, right? You're looking into something. There's always a reason, and maybe it doesn't even align with what everybody else's reason is. But I always think like there's something that we want out of this. There's a certain outcome that we want out of it. And that's like what informs us to stay curious or adjust our processes, like adjust like what technologies we use and how we use them. Like there's a reason why there's there are some engineers or some folks who are dead set on ensuring that some things are performant. That's just them, and sometimes like that's the kind of people you want on your team. And if you are in a culture where that's like the norm, like all the more power to you.
Yeah, most definitely. And you mentioned something about the tools, right? So we talked about people over process. Can we say people over process over tools?
I think so. I mean, it's tough because it's as tech people, I want to see the tools, right? Because that's like it's sometimes hard to step back and like, look at GetFlow, it looks so cool. I want to implement this to my entire team, and not actually look, like Tiffany said, you got to keep your eye on the overall vision, because it's too easy to get lost in the tool set of like, I want to implement, Flux CD operator. I want to implement, Tecton pipelines, because it's new and shiny, but like, do I need that for my overall?
I mean, for developers, it feels like a no-brainer. But if we talk about from the business side of views, right? So over there, like it may be obvious to developers, but we also need to say like how much is it supporting the business case of the company. So you look at the process. Okay, this is what you want to do. This is what you want to achieve, and then you look at what the tools options are or whatever. I'm looking for answers here. Like, anyone would like to add on to it? Tiffany, how about you? What are your views on this?
Oh, what are my views on? Sorry, what was the question?
People over process over tools.
I don't know. People over process over tools. I kind of see. I don't know. I don't really see it as a hierarchy per se. But if we were to kind of think of it as a hierarchy, I would say a lot of the foundations, like if you want to take it from like a different perspective, like for example, engineering versus product, right? That going back to business significance, I would say that a lot of what we do engineering and technology wise is essentially the foundations of what we're going to be able to achieve in terms of building like business significant or business impacts through technology, right? That's just kind of like the natural crux of it, right? If you don't have infrastructure, then you don't have software services, and now you don't have business outcomes or business services, right? So that's one way that you can look at it. But again, when I say engineering, right, that also encompasses people, process, and technology. So if you go back to the actual question, right, I tend to not look at it as a hierarchy. I see it as like more like a Venn diagram where things kind of touch together, right? Because I mean, you can have technologies, they don't like right now they don't work with people without people, right? Someone working with the technologies. And again, like processes are nothing without people, like or technology, right? What is a process is just an idea without an actual material form or action taken by someone else. And yeah, what can people do without technology in the tech space and engineering? So I really think that it is just kind of like a Venn diagram, and that's how we should think about it. Is like we give and take and trade off in certain areas, but we never lose sight of the whole picture, right?
I love that idea of a Venn diagram. Maybe people slightly bigger than the tools in the process, or maybe tools are embedded in the process. I guess it depends on how you want to organize it, but I love that concept.
Yeah, that answers my question. Thanks a lot for sharing, Tiffany. All right, Steve, would we were talking about this before. So we talk about like aim for automation for everything, right? In order to reduce the toils. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so and kind of dovetails from the tools process people conversation, which I assume kind of where you were going, Canal. Toil tends to be the thing that kind of, at least for me, really drives down my satisfaction, right? When you're doing these repetitive processes and you're in IT and you're like, wait a minute, I'm literally, I'm in a career that's designed to, eliminate human waste, right? To automate things. So I have to make sure, like within my job, I do that. And it's sometimes is tough, right? Because you just want to fix a problem, especially like from an operations side. Like, oh, I'll just go in there and flip these 3 switches or, configuration parameters, and I've solved my load balancer and it works now. But I don't think about the long-term impact of that. So that tends to be the tough part for me. One theory that I've come across that I found helpful is this idea of do nothing scripts, which it sounds bizarre, but the idea is that if you're doing a process and you don't really have a lot of time to automate it fully, you automate at least a script that tells you what to do as a person, right? So you're at least, let's take shell scripting just as a simplistic example. So if I have a process to add a new user, I create a shell script and like I don't have time. Let's say you're in a position where you don't have time to automate like adding a new user. So I create a shell script with the functions kind of lay out in pseudocode, what this process should be. And all the functions do is, print out to the console, okay, to add a user, step 1, step 2, step 3. So you commit that to your source repo or wherever. And then as you have time, you take those functions and you actually automate them, right? Like, oh, well, step 2 was, look up in the HR system what their job title was. Well, there's an API I can hit for that. So I can, slowly flesh out this script to eventually be fully automated. But I found that kind of a useful tool for making sure that I myself don't fall into an anti-pattern of just solving a problem without addressing like long-term automation needs.
Thanks for sharing, Steve. And can you maybe touch upon this a little bit more? Like, so you're talking about scripts, right? So where does that fit into the DevOps like cycle of automation?
Oh, that's a good. You got me thinking about like the overall DevOps like architecture. Where would this sit? Because a lot of the toil I think of immediately tends to be break fix, like within an operation cycle. And you know what? A server went down. Well, that doesn't really fit in the DevOps cycle, right? But it has to be fixed from a business process standpoint.
Hmm.
I could see this kind of on the development side. So in my idea, let's say it's a break fix because a server went down. My immediate, okay, so you fix the problem, right? And maybe automate it. But then it probably should go into like a retrospective to say, okay, why did this happen? And why did it require manual intervention to fix? Because the idea is you take that manual steps out of the process. So I can almost see like going through a DevOps life cycle of, okay, let us develop a solution, like let us test it, let us build a testing framework so that we know that when individual servers go down, it's handled in a as automated fashion as we can handle such a scenario. And of course, in the cloud, it's a lot easier, but in some ways, sometimes I fall back, like if you're running a physical data center and you really have a server that physically goes down, that's a little harder to address. But in the modern world, we go to places like Civo, right? And then I don't worry about it because you handle all that work for me. So
yeah. So like for cloud, so for example, what you're saying is like maybe like in between of, let's say, like the runbooks and the orchestration part, right? Somewhere around that. Cool. Thanks for sharing, Steve. That was a great answer. Tiffany, would you like to add your points over on this as well?
Yeah.
We talked about like automation and stuff.
Yeah, I actually like what Steve was saying. I hadn't heard of the concept of do nothing scripts, but I actually really like it because it always, like, there's, the most when you're doing it at that time, not like 10 months later when you go back to it and you're like, oh, what is this supposed to do? So I love that concept of just like, even if you just like it's just all of the like high level steps that you took, like at least it's there, and now it's not suddenly tribal knowledge when, I don't know, 6 months later you have to do this task again, or maybe it's not you who has to do it, it's someone else, right? It's not this long overbearing process that we've like cycle like that we now have to like go through. But that was an interesting question as well, Kunal, that you had mentioned as a follow-up, as like, well, how does this kind of tie into the bigger process? And I always like to think too, like when it comes to incidents, or like, yeah, what if a server went down? You would love to have a retro on this, right? Like let's close the feedback loop, right? Let's have a retrospective with the team and say like what went well, what didn't went well. Maybe the reason the server went down was, I don't know, because there was an application change that happened that caused that incident, and you would never have known if you didn't look into it and have conversations around it. So I think, again, like it's a nice feedback loop. And it almost reminds me of almost like the incident playbooks or the SRE playbooks and that sort of model that Google has around this type of work whenever there is like an incident, or like a server shuts down or doesn't start back up. So I really enjoyed what you were mentioning, Steve, around that.
Oh yeah, it had me
Thanks
thinking
for sharing,
about
Tiffany.
blameless postmortems too, which kind of goes into that, like retrospectives. Really hard to pull off, but if you can, especially if you happen to be the person that actually was responsible sort of for the outage, and it's tough to not just blame yourself. Like, I'm sorry, everyone, I was responsible, but it's refreshing to be part of a team that actually is like, no, we don't blame individuals, right? It was a process, something happened because, there was, the fact that a single person could bring down an application, right? That's a issue with the system overall. So let's address that. So yeah, blameless postmortems, amazing if you can pull it off. Very difficult because as human nature tends to be even to yourself, right? You want to be like, sorry everyone, I was responsible for that. But
yeah,
but it's
we're our own worst critics, like all the time, and I try to look at that too. And when I see it, when I see someone who feels bad because of something that happened and they think it's their fault, it's not. The reality is it's not, and a lot of times, I mean, even on small teams, right, where you feel like, oh, you're doing a little bit of everything, and because that one small thing that you had to do out of all of the long list of things that you had to do, that one thing didn't work well, and now it's suddenly your fault. I just always try to look at the big picture of like, you did everything that you could possibly do. Like, all the time, like every sprint, like if people are like, everyone's trying their best, what more could you do aside from just give someone grace? And I think, in a retrospective, that's when, we should focus less on the people aspect of it, and just try to think about, well, what did we have, what could we have that could help us in the future as people, right? And sometimes it's a process, sometimes, it's automation, and that's a great way to bring up, like, oh, well, maybe, there was no script, or there was no failover mechanism, and that's what we introduce now.
Most definitely. So what you're saying is like the empathy is key.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's that people over process, right? You need empathy, otherwise it kind of breaks down, right?
Cool. Yeah, Steve, maybe you'd like to share a bit more about that, like how you can bring
Yeah,
possible
that's
solutions.
and this was a small story I had, and this is actually back when I was a traditional system administrator. So this is like an older organization, separate dev, separate ops, but relatively small. So I'll tend to communicate quite a bit. We had gone through a recent project of implementing security controls across our servers. So of course causes a bit of difficulty, right? Because everyone has to get used to new processes, new login. I have a unique login name, and I have to log everything. So in the midst of conversation with the developer, and they were just kind of griping, that kind of human nature, right? You're like, this is a pain, and just kind of letting it out. And they're like, wow, it's a lot more painful now because this process that I do across like multiple servers, I don't know, it was probably 5 or 6 servers every week or so. He'd log in and do this like manual process. Had no idea this existed, right? He just took it upon himself to do it, being a team player. So in his conversation, it's like, wait, you're doing this manual process yourself. As a sysadmin, I have tooling that can help out with that. So you approach him, and you don't want to be confrontational because, you don't want to say like, oh, you shouldn't have done that way. I have a better way. But if you come in a very non-direct, but more helpful, right? Hey, I have a method that might make this a little easier. Let's sit down and let's see if we can script this out. So you don't have to worry about all those security controls because we're going to help automate this process that you're doing manually and take this off your plate. So, of course, he's thrilled. Like when you approach it that way, like, wait, this is less things this gives me more time to actually do the development work I prefer to do versus this manual process that I had been doing in the past. So, and I just like the story because you don't need to be a DevOps engineer in SRE, right? You can just be, a sysadmin, you can a network engineer, you could be anyone, but just having that empathy, listening to people, and if you have a tooling, and if you have perhaps a way to improve the processes, approaching them and not necessarily, blaming them for not knowing what but come in with like a collaborative methodology that can be very helpful. It's tricky, right? It's that people over process, like trying to, people tend to be the hardest part of any equation to implement change like that. But approached correctly, you might gain some friends, right, by helping automate processes and toil that people might not even realize, that they have.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that story that you shared because it actually reminded me of like just a lot of great situations that I've been in where, like I maybe didn't know a technology, like, and that happens in a lot of our teams. We're cross-functional. Like we all have different concerns. We all have different responsibilities on the team. And I remember like not understanding quite a bit around it. And I was kind of tasked to do a lot of front end work, and that wasn't my specialty. And, we had a front end engineer who came in who had just started, and he just kind of went in and just showed me like all the best practices. And he didn't bother telling me like, oh, you don't know this and whatever, and that felt really good to me. And so when it was time to talk more about like, how do we want to work as a team and processes and like, what's our like Git flow strategy and Git process strategy, like I just went in and did the same. And I didn't spend time telling him like, hey, you're doing this wrong, or that's not how you do a pull request, or that's not how you do, that's not how you actually merge in code into the code base. I was just like, hey, here you go. This is how like most people do it. And like, don't spend time on the little things. That's like one of the biggest things when you're working in a team. Don't spend time on the little things. Don't expand any of the negativity or the things that you don't know, because what that does is it makes someone feel like they don't know what they don't know. And we always have things that we don't know. So I love that you mentioned, like, just focus on, like, what good things can actually come out of introducing a particular technology. And they don't have to take your suggestion. I mean, but now they learn something new, right? Or maybe now they know, like, oh, what do most teams do, or what is, like, sort of the standard around this, and like how can they start to integrate parts of it that work for them.
Yeah, I love this that we're talking about, like, communication, good practices. And now that we are working remotely, like most people, and we also mentioned a little bit about retrospectives, and many companies do retrospectives, in their own way. So the question is, maybe if you can sum up or just share your views on some communication and retrospective best practices and some of the mistakes you see that people make, and how one would go ahead with that. Anyone can take this one. So that's the last point of discussion for the session.
Oh, I'm very opinionated about my retrospectives, but that's just because I am more of a straightforward person. So I don't like to spend, like, these long, retrospective. Like, I don't want to take the whole team's time for us to not actually feel like we've improved things, because that could be one of the worst things. Is you bring people into a room, they tell you genuinely what's wrong, and you take no action on it, right? That's the worst that could happen. Now everyone feels like you didn't listen to them, you don't understand what the problem is. They spent time trying, they opened up to you. This is a vulnerable space where you share, like, what didn't actually go well. And if you're making suggestions, actionable insights into, like, next time, like, this is something that we can start to introduce to the team, then you're really, like, killing that kind of culture that you want to have around DevOps to begin with. So for me, like, it's always, for me, before I get into a retrospective, I at least take some notes and think about, like, what happened over the past week, even if, like, the only thing I can think of is just good things, like calling out good work. And that's what you want to do. You want to call out, what actually went well in your retrospectives, right? Celebrate people in this time, because this was this period of time where you literally set an intention to do something, and that person did that work, and they did a great job, and you should say that. So I always try to have, like, 2 or 3 things that I want to highlight, whether it's someone else on the team, or like a team contribution, or maybe we introduced a process that worked out really well, small things like that. I always try to have a few things around that. And then if there was something that was really frustrating to me, I'll also bring that up. And I think it's important to sometimes, like, it can be intimidating being the first person to speak up. But, like, for me, and again, like, in DevOps, you have to have catalysts. You have to have people that want to advocate for, some better processes and some better improvements moving forward. And for me, as, like, a manager, I want to set that culture from the top down however I can. So if I can show up being honest and vulnerable in that space, then I'm also paving the way for other people on my team who come over to do the same thing. So I think that's one of the things, is, like, and you can do that as an IC too. You can be an individual contributor, you could be an engineer. I was doing this when I was an engineer, and I was being, I was bringing that culture in. Just note that, like, in a retrospective, people are here to listen. So that's also the best time to influence certain things that you want to see, right? So if you want to see a culture where people are open to talking about things that frustrate them, you have to come in and do that, to influence that type of culture. So, I see retrospectives as being very, very valuable in that sense, because you are literally building the culture and building building the continuous improvement that you want to see. That was my hot take on all the.
I love that. I want to
I
be
love
part
that.
of your
Yeah.
retrospectives. I've been part of brutal, as you mentioned, Tiffany. Like, it's horrible to be part of a brutal retrospective where it's more just everything that went wrong in a sprint, or a release, without considering all the good that happened, all the effort that went into it. So completely agree with that. I love
Yeah.
your take on that.
Yeah, I think, like, the retrospectives I've been a part of, they also follow what, like Tiffany mentioned. Should be a safe space to share your, what your blockers are, for example, what went good, what went, bad, what could have been improved, what was lacking. And one more thing, like many people, I think I have seen many people do is during retrospectives is shout outs. So if someone went above and beyond to help you, you can give them a shout out in public, right? So yeah, that is great. Lots of nice pointers, and yeah, we are like about time as well. So thanks a lot for joining, Steve and Tiffany. Do you have any closing remarks? Anything you would like to share before we wrap this up? How about we go with Steve first?
Oh boy, closing remarks. I think overall, just as everything we mentioned today, it's always about thinking about people, right? And interacting with them, making sure that they're well engaged, and reducing the negative parts of their job. Kind of a lot of the key points of DevOps is kind of embedded in all that. So that's the best I could do for summarizing.
Yeah, I love that. I think it touches on like a lot of the points that we covered today, like whether it's, sharing a story around why we're doing this work, giving purpose to that work, or whether it's improving our processes or the way that we work in teams so that we can, improve and reduce toil in the workplace. I think like all of these things are really important. And it's like, again, it goes back to like, it's not one or the other, process or technology or people, but it's like all these things together, and how do we integrate them into a very cohesive process. And I love how we ended on retrospectives, because that's, one way that we can begin to do a better job of that. So thanks so much.
Most definitely. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing your insight. It was indeed a great session. For everyone else who have joined, thanks a lot. And this will be recorded, so you can watch it again. And you can watch all the previous DevOps Bootcamp sessions in the playlist. And yeah, we will see you in the next one, which is the last one, which is going to be, I believe, next week. Um, Thanks a lot for joining, everyone. Thanks a lot for the panelists as well for giving their time. And yeah, have a good day and a good night. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.